Oso shipshio, irashaimase, naferi. Welcome. I'm Dr. John Miller, Associate Professor of National Security Studies and a member of the Air Command and Staff College Distance Learning Faculty. Our guest today is Dr. Matthew Stafford. Dr. Stafford is the Chief Academic Officer for the U.S. Air Force's Squadron Officer College, located at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. He is a 29-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force, where he specialized in logistics and missile operations. The final years of his career were spent working in education programs. Upon his retirement, he worked at Air Command and Staff College, helping stand up the U.S. Air Force's first accredited online master's degree program. He joined SOX faculty in January 2009. Dr. Stafford holds degrees in business management, strategic studies, and history. His PhD in history is from the University of Alabama. The title of Dr. Stafford's presentation is Critical Thinking, Something to Think About. And indeed it is. This informative and thought-provoking introduction to critical thinking leads us from the incisive observations of Karl von Clausewitz to John Boyd's OODA loop and beyond. I'm sure you will find Dr. Stafford's talk both entertaining and instructive.
Good day. As you heard, I'm going to talk about critical thinking, something for us all to think about. Because I'm a historian, I'm going to start with a story from history. That's kind of one of the downsides of hiring a historian to do these types of talks. I'm going to start with the Battle of Jena and Arstadt. This is from the Fourth Coalition. Basically, the Fourth Coalition originates out of the Third. As soon as the Third Coalition is over, Prussia finds itself in a really undesirable state and realizes that it's surrounded by this new Napoleonic empire that's springing up around her. And she declares war on Napoleon. Napoleon's kind of surprised by this because, frankly, he's got about 60,000 troops that are in that general area, and they're going to immediately mobilize to go on the attack against Prussia. Nevertheless, Russia and the United Kingdom is going to join on Prussia's side, and we're going to have what's going to be another in the Napoleonic major wars. You can see that Napoleon goes to his troops and he tells them that but for these lousy Prussians, you would have gone home by now. And that incites a lot of anger amongst the French, and they're going to be phenomenal fighters in this. They're coming in on two axes into the Prussian forces. To the south, Napoleon's main body is going to meet the Prussians and defeat them at the Battle of Jena. After Jena, you're going to see some of the Prussians retreat. They're going to join the main body of the Prussian army up near Arstadt. But the arrival of these disenchanted troops, they're so depressed, they're so demoralized by this, that actually is going to start kind of a rout in the north too. Here you can see Murat at Arstadt. He's going to charge into the retreating Prussians and hack them to pieces. And there you see the retreating Prussians that are heading into the other force at Arstadt, and ultimately the Prussian forces are going to fall. Napoleon's going to march proudly into Berlin. He's going to go right up to Frederick the Great's tomb, ask his marshals to remove their hats and say, if this man had been alive today, we wouldn't be here. All this is background to the story to talk about a lesser officer who's on the field of battle at Jena Arstadt, and is going to play heavily in what I want to talk about today, and that man is Karl von Clausewitz. Clausewitz is basically part of the rear guard. His jobs are twofold. He's supposed to be part of the rear guard to defend the Prussian rear on the retreat, but he's also supposed to take care of his prince. Quite frankly, the job doesn't go particularly well for him. The heavy cavalry of the French is hacking the Prussians to pieces, and Clausewitz is barely able to take care of himself, let alone the prince. Both are captured, along with 25,000 Prussians that day, and they go into captivity. It's kind of a gentleman's agreement there in France. He's allowed to walk around the city, but he's on his honor that he can't leave. Well, Clausewitz is really disturbed by what has happened to Frederick the Great's wonderful Prussian army, what happened to his forces, but he's also disturbed by, as most of us would be, is kind of a post-traumatic shock that he goes through, slipping on the blood of his dead and dying troops there in the final battle. And he starts to write down his thoughts, and he basically creates a guide on how the world can deal with one of these evil geniuses like Napoleon Bonaparte. It's a fascinating book. Hopefully you'll get a chance to read it sometime in your life. It's Karl von Clausewitz's On War, von Krieg. He doesn't publish this during his lifetime. It's written during his lifetime. His notes are put together, and his wife publishes it after his death. Now, I'm going to argue that one of the reasons it's so disjointed is because a lot of it wasn't written for publication. A lot of it, I believe, is Karl von Clausewitz trying to deal with the demons in his own mind. So it's kind of a catharsis. But nevertheless, he's thinking and he's writing about a lot of really exciting and unusual things. We can extract from this book war theory. You can see war is the realm of physical exertion and suffering, and he describes what war is. And he talks about absolute war, which certainly that day at Jena, it must have seemed like absolute war to Karl von Clausewitz. He has some wonderful leadership insights. And you can kind of see in some of his leadership insights those demons that are preying on his mind. You can see that quote there on the right, must trust his judgment and stand like a rock which the waves break in vain. And those waves break around Karl von Clausewitz that day were the French heavy cavalry. He also writes political theory. He's scrutinizing the French forces and why they were so good and how they could get that kind of manpower into the field, all so loyal to l'Empereur. And lastly, he talks about what I really want to talk about, which is that idea of critical analysis. He's coming up with a way to think about war in a different way that's been thought before so that we can come up with some rules and maybe even some prescriptions of what will and will not work. And clearly that ability to think critically about warfare is one of the reasons that we still hold this book so precious in military history. That's what I'm going to talk about in this short talk. I'll give you an overview of Clausewitzian critical analysis. Then we'll spend a little time talking about thinking, metacognition. I'll give you some comparative techniques for thinking, and then we'll put some of this into practice. This is the Clausewitzian critical analysis. Karl was kind of long-winded in his day. If you read it in the original German, it's no better, I'm sorry to say. It's just kind of a difficult book to struggle through. The Michael Howard, Peter Perret translation is probably the best in English right now, and I commend it to your time. Nevertheless, you are going to have to struggle with some of the more obtuse language. The first part of this is discover and interpret facts. Karl would tell us that you need to get all the facts. And sometimes the facts are more complex and you have to dig deeper than you thought. You get an overview of a battle or you get an overview of a situation and there's so much more at play, down to the individual soldier level sometime. Then he wants us to trace those effects back to the causes. And so we can identify those relationships because those relationships are going to prescribe what we should do in the future. And lastly, he wants us to look for alternatives. Look for better courses of action than the ones that were taken as we go through historical battles. And when you're building your plans for future encounters and future courses of action, you want to look for alternatives too, things that you can do better or things that you can do in case your primary action fails. One battle I like to use, for example, is the Battle of Little Bighorn, because most people know it. Oddly enough, if you ask most American school kids to name 5 battles, this is one of the battles that pops up. And of course, they usually call it Custer's Last Stand. Now it's referred to by historians as Battle of Little Bighorn. Interestingly, surveys indicate that most school kids will choose battles where the Americans lost, which I find absolutely fascinating. The Alamo, Bunker Hill, etc. Nevertheless, this is one that's fairly popular, and I use it because I hope you're familiar with this battle as well. That's a map of the battle and what was happening. If we were to use Clausewitz critical analysis, though, we'd start dissecting this battle and we'd start to ask ourselves questions about the facts. Who was in charge at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and what role did personalities play? While we have General Custer himself, he's the youngest general in the Union Army. He's audacious in battle. He seems to have this idea that he's protected by Custer luck. At one point during the Civil War, he rides into the Confederate lines. He's completely surrounded by them. He gives a cheer and a tally-ho, and he gallops off back to his own lines. So you have a man here who believes that he's destined for greatness, and he's audacious in battle. He's risk averse, or not risk averse at all, I mean. He's very, very courageous, and some of his subordinates are going to think him even foolhardy. He's facing Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull is a spiritual leader for his people. He's also a military leader. Sitting Bull comes to fame when, as a young man, he basically fights a duel. The most powerful warrior is facing him. Sitting Bull comes out, and as they start to face each other, Sitting Bull starts to sing. Everyone's absolutely shocked by this behavior. He seems absolutely fearless. They go towards each other. The enemy manages to wound Sitting Bull quite severely in his ankle, a wound he'll carry for the rest of his life, and produce a slight limp and a big scar, and Sitting Bull kills him. This earns immediate respect, and he's going to be a respected member of his people for the rest of his life. He's had a vision of this battle. In his vision, the American troops are going to attack from the east, and his people will soundly trounce them. And he's going to share this vision with his people, and it's going to ultimately lead them to victory in this encounter. Under Custer, he's got Major Marcus Reno. Reno is definitely, he's called a hothead for his time. He has a bad temper. He doesn't particularly like his boss. And there's strong indications that he had a drinking problem throughout his career. He's going to be sent in to the south there. You can see on the east side of the village, and his nerve is going to break. He attacks the village, realizes he's hopelessly outnumbered. He dismounts, sets up a firing line. The Indians charge. He orders a remount. There's overwhelming fire. He orders a dismount again. The Indian guide holding his horse is hit in the head with a large caliber weapon. The brains explode all over Reno's vest, and at that point he loses it, calls for a retreat, and it's a rout across the river. So some of the problems that you see here are because that pincer movement wasn't affected well, largely because the leadership broke on the left side. He's also got Frederick Benteen. Benteen is a noble type from the South. He despises his boss. He cannot stand Custer. He writes kind of hopefully in his memoirs that Custer would die, and he wants to go and see that it's actually happened. When it actually does happen, he's quite surprised because he never thought anything could happen to the boy general. But nevertheless, Benteen is not a powerful fan of Custer. And Sitting Bull, one of his subordinates, is Crazy Horse, the aptly named Crazy Horse, aptly named because he too is fearless in battle. He's going to go at great risk to himself and sweep over the Union forces at the end of this battle, wiping out Custer when they stand at the top of Last Stand Hill. So we could argue that certainly leadership played a role in this. The nerve, the cohesion that the American forces had as opposed to the American Indian forces was not as good. The Indian forces were operating both spiritually and militarily under the guidance of this single supreme ruler, if you will. But there's other aspects of this battle that we could look at if we're going to follow Clausewitz's advice and pull the facts apart. We could look at firearms. This is a survivor's depiction of the battle. It kind of coordinates with one of the American survivors of the battle, the Army survivors, who indicates that about half of the Indians were bearing firearms, and of those, about half were modern firearms, including repeating rifles. You can see in this depiction here by one of the Indian survivors that he depicts two braves on horseback using traditional American weapons, but that there's also other braves that are pictured who are using firearms. And there's actually, in this picture, more firearms than there are traditional weapons. When you start to look at those firearms, and we have this from the data that we've collected from survivors, but also from the archaeological studies that have been made on the sites, the types of bullets and the weapons encountered, that some of these firearms were pretty modern. The troopers were using the Springfield trapdoor carbine, model 2873. It had 100 rounds of ammunition. They could fire one round at a time, and frankly, the rounds would tend to get stuck as it got hot. So the troopers would have to keep a knife handy so they could pry out a cartridge to stick in another one. They also had the 45 caliber handgun. Custer was given the opportunity to take Gatling guns into the battle. He chose not to. He felt that they would slow him down on the rugged terrain of eastern Montana. There's a lot of speculation. Had he had the Gatling guns, would he have fared better? Most historians will agree that probably not. That the terrain was so unlevel that the Indians probably would have gotten behind him anyway, and that they would, in fact, as Custer predicted, just have slowed him down. So we'll skip the Gatling guns, but let's look at the Indian firearms. They're carrying some modern Henry rifles. That's the Henry repeating rifle of the 1860 period. And the Henry model for the company was load on Sunday, shoot all day, because that's a 7-round tubular magazine. They also had some of the modern Winchesters, which are derived from the Henry model, and they had a lot of older weapons, like that third one that you see. But in terms of weaponry, there's a strong argument to be made that the cavalry was outgunned by the Indians and outnumbered, and we'll get to that in a moment. Let's talk about numbers. The troopers are coming in with about 700. They anticipate that in front of them lies a village where somewhere between maybe 700 and 1,000 to 1,500 braves. Reports vary. They're basing this on what they have from the Indian agency about the renegades who are somewhere out west. What they haven't taken into consideration, and the Indian agents haven't told them, is that over the last couple of weeks, Indians have been abandoning the reservations and heading out west to join the bands at a pretty regular pace. So Sitting Bull's forces are growing. Again, they pictured that there'd be somewhere under 1,000. In actuality, there were many more. Custer decides to split his forces in a pincer movement. He's going to take Reno to the left. He's going to have Benteen in back, who's going to be a supporting force to the company in need, and he's going to take his own company there to the right. What's going to happen, of course, is Reno's going to be defeated on the left, and largely because Sitting Bull's army is much, much larger than Custer ever anticipated. And he's going to defeat the cavalry forces in detail. First, he's going to take all of his forces over, and he's going to annihilate Reno's fighting force. Reno's going to retreat to a hill where eventually Benteen will join him, and then that entire force is going to go over and destroy Custer's forces. And that's exactly what happened.